Hello and welcome to the EXP Required podcast, where we talk about Final Fantasy and other things. I'm Jack, and I'm, as always, joined by Mole. How you doing, Mole?
Hello, not too bad. The weather has turned. I'm no longer melting in the sun every time I go outside. Instead, I'm being blown from side to side, which is not an improvement, actually. I want the sun back. Please bring the sun back.
We're never right. We're never happy in this country, are we?
No, God,
Um,
no.
I don't mind as long as it's not windy. I could do with cold, but the wind just annoys me intensely.
It's the rain that I don't like.
Rain I'm all right with, but wind, like, get lost. It can't decide what it wants. Sort yourself out, wind. Anyway, what have you been up to recently? Have you been up to anything exciting?
I did actually find something very exciting this morning. I was looking through Steam and I managed to stumble across a arcade game of my childhood. So I'm very much looking forward to sitting down and playing Golden Axe at some point in the near future, because that made up a much larger chunk of my childhood than I'd care to admit to.
For a second there, when you said I found an arcade game of my childhood, I thought you meant that like there was actually an arcade game of like you. I don't know
Oh,
what,
I'm actually
like
8-bit. I
from your
crawled out of
childhood.
the
Yeah,
screen, yeah.
a Golden Axe. What a game! I don't think I've ever beaten it. I've done it co-op. It's great fun. Right, today we're going to talk about Final Fantasy 3. We spoke about Final Fantasy 6. This is the real Final Fantasy 3, the actually correct Final Fantasy 3. So this was the third Final Fantasy released, funny enough, and originally was released on the Famicom in Japan on April 27th, 1990. Later on, it was released as a 3D remake, late 2006 in Japan and America, or North America, and early 2007 for Europe, because, of course, we get everything slightly later than everyone else, or was
Of
certainly used to.
course.
That version, which was like a 3D remake, was then ported to PSP and I think Steam in 2012.
I believe so, yes. I think it was
Yeah,
a PSP, went to Android, and then to Steam later on.
yeah, so a much sexier looking version than the Nintendo DS version. And then the Pixel remaster came in 2021 and then came to, I think, Switch and PS4 in 2023. So this is an interesting game because it's actually the game that took the longest to come out, as you can see there, because that was the first time, 2006, where this game was actually playable in some form outside of Japan.
No other Final Fantasy game in the series actually had anywhere near that length of time between original release and coming out, did it?
No, this was particularly this is like the sort of the Lost Ark of the Covenant type of things. So, want to talk about personal memories of this game?
You go first.
As I've alluded to here, this was the missing one. So we got Final Fantasy Origins, which had a 1 and 2, Final Fantasy Anthology, which had 4 and 5. That's the European anthology. And then 6 released on its own, released on PlayStation, and then they came out on GBA at some time later. As I've said there, FF3 didn't get a proper 2D remake until 2021 with the Pixel remaster. So I remember when this got announced, because I'd gone back and collected stuff back in the early 2000s, that those specific games, and didn't have 3. I used to search on the internet a lot about, oh my God, where is 3? If you know anything about me, I'm a collector at heart. So having 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, it bugged me not having 3.
It's like looking at a bookshelf and seeing like a number missing out of a collection and just being like, I know
Yeah,
it exists. I know it exists.
definitely had that feeling a lot. So as it drove me to track down the NES version of the game, which was very, very difficult to do. At the time, this is going back to, I think, probably 2004 at this point. I talked in the past about the earlier games having like sprite webcomics and flash animations and things like that, which sort of got me involved with those games on a sort of community level, I guess you could say. This game was legendary because there wasn't really much that existed from even in terms of screenshots and things like that back in the day. I mean, this is something we take for granted now with YouTube and the fact that you've got 8 million people now playing Let's Plays of every game ever invented. Finding screenshots was really tricky. I'd probably imagine you felt the same with a lot of stuff. But the only image from this game that I managed to find was the Cloud of Darkness boss at the end of the game. And that was the only image I actually saw from the actual game. And of course, the box art, which is I think it's supposed to be one of the Warriors of Light with swords or something like that.
Yes.
So that was the only sort of visual representation of the entire game I had. I had knowledge of stories and stuff about it and how it was, a game that brought in these onion knights and things like that. And it was just a legendary thing that was talked about on the internet, but never found or anything like that. So do you have an experience like that with this game at all?
Not to the same degree as you. I do remember growing up and probably around the same kind of time. So the very early 2000s, kind of realizing that obviously, I think at that time, 7, 8, and just about 9 had kind of come out. So I was like, okay, right. I know of all of these other games, but 3 is definitely missing. But I didn't have access to the internet when I was younger in my home. So
Right.
it was very difficult for me to actually look stuff like this up. I had to wait until I was on the school internet. And as you can imagine, they don't really take too kindly to you doing things that aren't homework in the school's library.
Wow.
So I wasn't really able to look anything like that up. You mentioning the screen of the Cloud of Darkness does ring a bell. I feel like I might have seen that once upon a time as well, but it didn't really stick with me. 3 was just the missing link, and it was so missing that in my mind, I didn't really stick with it at all. Like, I just completely forgot that it was even supposed to have existed. Then I grew up a bit more, found out that, the US version of FF6 was called FF3. It was like, right, yeah, FF3, that was meant to exist. What the hell happened? And then I believe I mentioned in our Final Fantasy IV episode that I specifically bought my Nintendo DS to play Final Fantasy IV. It was by absolute luck that the day that I went and bought the Nintendo DS that I saw Final Fantasy III sat on the shelf next to 4. So I thought, I'm going to get that as well, and snagged it on the same day. Didn't play it immediately because 4 was the priority in those days. But yeah, I did eventually come back to it, did play the DS version, and it's only the DS version that I have played. Now, doing a little bit of research before this episode into just the differences between the different versions, I'm not too sure how aware you are of the differences between the versions. Have you got any idea?
I know that there are essentially three different versions of this game.
Yes.
You've got the original Famicom version, you've got the DS remake, which was then ported to PSP and made to look sexier, and then you've got the third version, which is the Pixel remaster, and they all pretty much are, from an RPG standpoint, very different games. All the numbers and everything in them are completely different. You can't read a guide.
Exactly it.
You can't read a guide for one that tells you the other two, which is a bit quirky and weird, isn't it? So
yeah, it's one of those things that I actually think of as really quite fascinating, because most remasters and even stuff that's been rebuilt from the ground up, like the Final Fantasy IV remake, they don't do that. You don't really see that in anything ever. So the fact that they went to such lengths to actually change these games, even the Pixel remaster not being the same as the Famicom version, is still really interesting to me. So at some point, I would like to sit down with all 3 of these versions and play through them again, just to experience just how different they are personally.
Yeah.
But as of time of recording, it's only the DS version that I've experienced.
which is interesting because I have not really experienced the DS version. I have. I mean, a little bit more personal history. Back in 2005, I went into a bit of a Nintendo fanboy phase. So I had a Game Boy, like most people that were born in the 90s. Game Boy was my sort of first real console. Played a lot of DOS games as well.
DOS, that brings me back.
Yeah. So, and then I had a PlayStation 1 was my first actual physical hardware, hardwired into the house console. So that's where I got my Final Fantasy start from. Then in 2002, for Christmas, I got a GameCube. So I didn't get the PS2 till later. So I became a bit of a Nintendo fanboy for a few years. And that's because, a friend I had I'd made in secondary school at that time was really into Nintendo. So we went into that gang. And there's something about that kind of culture of like, you defend your console to the sort of hilt kind of thing. Which is to do with the fact that when you're a kid, you can only really afford one, or your parents can only really afford one, When I say went off Final Fantasy, it stopped me playing 10 initially. But when I heard this was getting released on the DS, I felt like, yes, they're finally releasing the game that I had missing on one of my consoles because it was the DS. And of course, then I got it and didn't really play it because didn't particularly like it. Now, the reason I didn't particularly like it isn't because it looked bad. It was because I felt like I was playing an adaptation of an original game. I wanted to play the original version, but I did feel good that I had it on my shelf and I could put it between the other games. That kind of scratched that itch. I mean, at one point, I was actually going to, off eBay, buy a Famicom cartridge just to have the third one on my shelf.
Oh, that's dedication.
Because it just bugged me. So on that thread a little bit, I remember like there were some early screenshots of this game, and this was obviously after Final Fantasy IX had come out. And I remember it might have been a concept screenshot, and it was the 4 Warriors of Light fighting. I think it's something in an ice cave, and the angle pretty much looks exactly the same as the ice cave in Final Fantasy IX. I remember showing my friend, look how good the graphics can be on Nintendo DS, and he was blown away by that. So I got quite involved with the early marketing of this game in that sense. I remember that might have been E3 2004. I remember the crystal coming up, and then the text coming down. We're finally bringing out Final Fantasy III into the Western territories. And that being a big deal, and waiting for that to happen, and then never actually playing it. But I did play, and this is another bit of what I found a few times from this podcast we've done, is I've played these games more than I thought in a lot of instances. I think I've started off by saying, I didn't play much of them, and then realised actually I remember a lot of this stuff. I played a fan translation that I managed to track down in 2004. Which actually It's really, really funny because I think I've alluded to in the past that finding anything about this game on the internet back then was nigh impossible because you type FF3 in and of course FF6 comes up because the Americans called it FF3.
Still happens. Still happens.
So that finding the fan translation of this game on a ROM, not that you'd really need to, I guess, anymore, unless you were specifically looking at that specific ROM, was just as hard to find. Literally, it felt like I'd gone back in time 20 years. Like, oh my God, like I'm doing exactly the same thing. I remember it being an absolute challenge and a half getting the game to sort of work. And my memory of it up until, I guess, a few weeks ago was that I'd managed to get the game working, got the translation patch into the game, and then didn't play much of it and thought, that's it, I'm done now. But actually, like, I remember a lot about the early part of the game. Just to sort of hone in on the particular fan translation, because I like celebrating these things. This was on romhacking.net. The translation description says, "This is a wonderful, well done professional translation. The only problem I have with it is, hell, I'm just kidding. I just can't think of things to say. It's really great. Let's just leave it at that." That's the quote on romhacking.net. It was released by Alex W. Jackson, Neil Corlett, who also contributed to Bahamut Lagoon that we mentioned a few episodes ago, and SOM2 Freak. And this was like a bit of a legendary thing on forums back in the day, finding this translation because it was the only one in existence, right? Or certainly the only decent one. You know, I don't know how it ranks compared to the modern translation, but it made the game playable. Because the problem with RPGs is that you need to be able to read the text.
Yeah.
you could play a ROM of I'd like some random like Mario game and like pretty much just get the whole thing going without having to
hammer the buttons and you'll
hammer
be
the
fine
buttons and whatever. But with an RPG, you need it in English, otherwise you're not going to have a clue unless you're fluent in Japanese. In the early part of the game, you go around an island. I can't remember the name of the island, but you start in a cave, and then you go to the town of, is it or Ur?
One of those. I've never known how to pronounce it personally.
Basically what it is just like people turn around to you and say, "Where'd you come from?" You go, that's probably what they were going for. In the initial stage of the game, you go find Sid very quickly and he gives you an airship. And I remember thinking, wow, you got an airship this early in the game. But the airship has a limitation which only allows you to sort of fly around and not go over mountains. And so you're boxed into the early part of the game. And when I played this recently on the Pixel Remaster, I remember, oh my God, I remember exploring this for hours as a kid. So it was a really nice trip down memory lane. And I remember that early area being quite nostalgic in that sense.
I always found it really quite interesting upon playing it and getting a lot further in the game that the early area of Final Fantasy III, which is the floating continent, is actually really surprisingly well fleshed out, as much as it can be for FF3, and we'll talk about that later on.
Yep.
But there is a surprising amount of content and things to do in the early part of the game, to the point where once the world actually opens up, it's like, oh shit, okay, there's so much more to do in this world. You know, I feel like they probably could have kept the entire game on the floating continent, and it might have felt a little bit cramped after a while, but like it would have taken a while to get to that point.
Yeah.
It just being one very small part of a much wider world was genuinely kind of mind-blowing, and
totally.
I imagine it probably was even more so when it first released in 90 to Japanese audience as well. I can't even imagine what that would have been like.
That's an interesting point, because this game, from what I understand, was a big hit in Japan. It was like the first real Final Fantasy that really sort of nailed it, and it was probably the one that they heralded back to themselves quite a lot. So it would have been quite interesting if you think about it. The DS remake we've talked about was the first release outside of Japan, but it was also the first re-release of the game full stop for Japanese audiences, I believe. So that came out in 1990. You have 15 years of re-releases in your own continent or your own country of the games you've loved, apart from this one. So they probably have a similar relationship in a sense. It's like probably different because not many of them have the experience I have of playing this as a kid. I'm probably quite unique in that respect. I mean, I'm not the only one. Obviously, there's a lot of people that translated the game and played it, but it's interesting how this game actually, it's pretty good. I mean, we'll get into the sort of nitty-gritty of everything in a minute. In terms of its comparison to the first two games that have come out, it's so much bigger in scope than the first two games. I mean, I think it takes a step back in some ways in terms of storytelling, because certainly in the original version, the characters that you play as don't have really any characterization. They're kind of blank slates for the most part. Whereas Final Fantasy II, obviously people that listen to this podcast know that me and Moll are fans of Final Fantasy II. We're quite unique in that respect. We're not on the hate train. We're fans of it. It's good. But you could argue this was a step back in that, but it's probably the only thing it was a step back in, because like, my God.
Yes. And there are reasons for that as well. I found recently a couple of interviews from the 30th anniversary of Final Fantasy III's release. It was a couple of interviews that was done with Hiromichi Tanaka, who worked on game design for the original first three Final Fantasies. Later, he was the director and executive producer for the DS remake of FF3, and he was the original producer for Final Fantasy XIV, and I'll talk about that at a completely different time. And there was another one with Koichi Ishii, who again worked on the first three Final Fantasies. He was later the director of Final Fantasy XI. He's also the person who developed the whole like crystal motif for the Final Fantasy brand. So this was a real treat to read anyway, because like these people have been instrumental in getting the brand off of the ground. But Tanaka, who was the game designer and then later executive producer, he was quoted as saying in this interview, when we first started work on FF3, there were already hints about the SNES coming out. And we'd already learned how to make good use of the NES carts. But, you know, we'd gotten to the point where data sizes that we were using were about double that of what we had done for FF2. So we were making Final Fantasy III on the NES with the mentality of pushing the amount of data that could be packed into the absolute utmost limits, which when you look at the two worlds side by side, that immediately becomes apparent. Not to mention, you know, little things like the insane amount of battle sprites, all of the different like things that have been inputted into this world. There was one question in this interview that was just like, it feels to us that Final Fantasy III has a reputation for being game mechanics heavy and, you know, less story heavy. And Tanaka's response is, well, that's because Kawazu wasn't involved. When Kawazu-san creates stories, they have a distinctive characteristic to them. So his involvement often has a tendency that those games are remembered as story heavy as opposed to mechanic heavy. It immediately snapped to me once I read those words of like, there is such a huge distinction between 2 and 3, not just in the way that it looks and the way that it runs, but like actually, mechanics over story as opposed to story over mechanics. We've discussed Final Fantasy II on a previous episode as well, but I believe I alluded to Kawazu-san and his whole, I want to make something that's memorable, not necessarily good. Nowhere has it become more clear to me than the boundary between 2 and 3 that is exactly the case, actually.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because, I mean, moving slightly on to what you said there about the size of the game and stuff like that, and wanting to push the Famicom's hardware because they pretty much developed 2 titles and gotten good at it. And this, similar to 6, which was the last one on the SNES or Super Famicom, was the last game on the original Famicom. Now, this game was released in Japan on April 27th, 1990, which we talked about before, and the Super Famicom released on November the 21st, 1990. So this came out
close
before the SNES or the Super Famicom was released. So it made it. This is literally like probably not the last title that was released on the Famicom, but it's certainly
very much up there,
signed the era out, should we say. And I mean, like, alluding back to the point I made before about being a bit of a Nintendo fanboy, back in the day, the Nintendo DS was went up against the PSP, and the PSP's big selling point was that you could play movies and listen to music on it, right? UMDs were a big thing. And of course, we talked about that before when we talked about Advent Children. And of course, at the time, it was so obvious the PSP was better than the DS. I didn't want to admit it as a kid. And of course, you know, as you are, as I was as a stupid 14-year-old kid, I was like, no, what I'm going to do is I'm going to buy loads of add-ons like a movie player for the Game Boy Advance or DS that you can put in. And it just doesn't work very well. But also that particular thing, it was a GBA movie player, doubled as a NES emulator, but it only doubled as a NES emulator with certain file sizes. So like a lot of the early NES games you could put on it, no problem. But this one was particularly big, too big for it. So I couldn't play the game on the go, which kind of put me off carrying on with the game because I would have enjoyed playing it as opposed to on an old laptop. I would have preferred playing it with like a handheld kind of thing. Looking back now, okay, it's understandable why it was so huge. I think it was something like 2.5 times the file size of every other NES game or something like that. I mean, it was still kilobytes, but at the time, I mean, that was
still a lot of kilobytes.
I mean, there's a few little quirks with this one, like so you mentioned there like lots more animations that have been added, the animation sprites. One of the big things that was added to this game, which probably sounds quite, I wouldn't say lost to time in a sense, because of course there have been so many different remakes of different versions and stuff like that. Every job has a custom hit reaction for every job.
Yes.
And that's a big deal. Well, certainly a big deal at the time, because the original 2 games, like I think the character would flash or maybe jolt slightly depending on when they were hit.
You and I have watched the same video. I can tell.
We'll have a shout out. New Frame Plus is the name of the guy that does the videos on the art of these games. It's an absolutely incredible bit of YouTube stuff you need to go and watch. So yeah, no, that's really, really good because it explains about how all I don't know how many jobs there are. Is it 22? I think it might be 22 in Final
I
Fantasy
think
5.
22,
But there's a
yes.
lot of jobs in this game, and the idea is that each job has a palette swap of what the character's doing, and they all brace themselves slightly differently when they're hit by an enemy, which is really, really incredible, especially for the time. I mean, that's cool, and it's great to see someone delve into the details of that for a game that's kind of been forgotten to time. But the original Famicom version, it's good that that's been celebrated in some respects now, I think, because it
No,
was
I
impactful.
absolutely agree with you. And I think one of the things that makes that so impactful as well is the fact that they really did take a step back from the story. So obviously we came from Final Fantasy 2 where you've got that worldwide conflict and characters that aren't necessarily very deep, but they do have some character. And we don't really get that at all in 3. So then to see these like tiny little battle sprites actually have some emotive response in the battle scene is really special, actually, because they've still managed to pack it full of character without having really any proper characters in it.
Cool.
Until the DS remake, of course. And that doesn't really have the same kind of effect because at that point you're using 3D models, you know, the technology has changed and upgraded. Going back to that 30th anniversary interview, the guy who created the crystal motif, so this is Koichi Ishii, he actually had a lot to do with that. And when I say a lot to, I mean all of. He not only designed the crystal motif, but this man designed the chocobo,
All
designed the
right.
Moogle, and did all of the job character designs. I believe when they were still going through like initial planning stages, Ishii was the one who suggested that each job had an individual command. So again, we'll talk about the battle system a bit later, but every single job in a game has an attack, it has an item, but then they'll all have something that's unique to the job, which brings the identity into play. Ishii was in charge of creating the actual icons and avatars for these job portraits. And he says in this interview that he didn't want to reuse anything whatsoever. He didn't want it to be just like copy and paste from the original Final Fantasy 1. He wanted the jobs to have very clear differences. But of course, this being the 8-bit time on the Famicom, there were only 3 colors that he could really use for each character. And that's how stuff like the Black Mage came about. Because in the original Final Fantasy 1, I believe he makes note that they're not very cute. You have 6 designs and they're very static, and then a little bit later on they get an upgrade and they get slightly bigger, and that's still not very cute at all. So he wanted all of these jobs to have their own unique identity. Naishi says that, you know, he didn't really think that he could make a believable design if he hadn't thought really strictly about the background story for each job and what kind of character it would be. So the white mage, for example, you have the very traditional white robes with like red or pink triangles and a hood up or sometimes down. He says that the red part of the white mage's robes, he always imagined that to be red threads that were imbued with magic, which increases magical power. You know, the reason that it's on the sleeves is because magic comes through the hands and wrists. So he was really, really specific about the lore of every single thing that he created. And that's why they look as, I don't necessarily want to use the word detailed, but that is why they have so much identity in a way that the original jobs don't necessarily do. They're just kind
No.
of designs that differ between classes, which I just thought was a really interesting way of actually looking at character design and, okay, well, how do I make this stand out when I only have so many pixels to work with and 3 colors per palette? One of the most interesting things that he said was because one of those colors in all of the palettes had to be the skin tone. So technically, he's only really working with 2 colors.
Yeah.
You look at the Black Mage job, and he decided to sacrifice the skin tone for the Black Mage and just make it black and have the blue eyes, which allowed him to then use a different color. That so gold probably would have been the skin tone palette color in that case, but he didn't use it. He instead, you know, relegated it to the eyes and the hat, which makes it just stand out and has become since such an
Yeah.
iconic design. For a man who says that he's never once been a graphic designer, I think he sold himself rather short there.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's fair to say that they are, other than maybe Cloud, are the 2 most iconic Final Fantasy
Easily.
designs.
Easily.
I think maybe Cloud, and actually to an extent Squall as well, from a visual perspective. But no, when you open up the Pixel Remaster game, the White Mage and the Black Mage come towards the Pixel Remaster side in the middle. I see them, I think, Final Fantasy. I mean, the White Mage design,
Yeah.
like I say, is slightly more detailed in this game. I say slightly, it's a lot more detailed in comparative terms than the original, but it's slightly more
Yeah.
detailed from a modern perspective.
Yeah.
It does, it looks incredible. What a design. And I think as well, what I like about, and it's very prolific in this game, I mean, it's sort of noted in the first game to an extent because you do have the very beginnings of the job system there. The only difference is you can't change the jobs on the fly, get a class upgrade halfway through the game, but is that the characters aren't gendered necessarily. I mean, I know they are in the DS reboot, but in this game, like the designs, they're all the same for each character. So you can have pretty much 4 blank slates. Okay, they're different colors, but they can be whoever you want them to be. And then those jobs don't have necessarily feminine or masculine traits shown to them. They're whoever you want them to be, which I really like.
Yes, no, I 100% agree. In that interview, Ishii brings up the design of the white mage in Final Fantasy Tactics. Specifically, he's talking about like, oh, people have always imagined this to be that design. Okay, fair enough. But what I took away from it as well is you're completely right in that they are completely ungendered. These characters are whatever you want them to be. But then you have things like Final Fantasy Tactics, which do harken back to these old designs, but then they use different designs for male and female characters within that game, which in itself is really nice. I like to see a variety of costumes. I like to see how different people would wear those costumes. It's to my eternal chagrin that the core characters in Final Fantasy Tactics don't actually change outfit when you put them in a different class. At least they do here. And to be fair, all of the characters, they really feel very unique, all of these job identities. Like the Bard and the Ranger, they share the same palette. They look very, very similar, but they look different enough that I can recognize each of them at a glance.
Yeah, it's interesting. We're not going to talk about Final Fantasy V too much because it's going to have its own episode, but Final Fantasy V was the extension of this initial game system, and that had 5 core characters, which each had their own individual designs for each job when you could change them in the job system. Most of the time it makes it pretty obvious which character you're playing as. Sometimes it's a bit of a surprise, but it's cool because they each have their own set of dress in that style, which kind of takes it a different way. And in a way, the argument that can be made here is that for only the Onion Knights at the beginning are distinguished from each other, and these characters, when you move through, they look exactly the same. But I think in a way that's cool. I don't think it takes away from it too much because this game is supposed to be an extension of that Final Fantasy 1 D&D make your own adventure type thing. All right, so let's talk about the job system. So we've hinted at the job system for a while on different episodes. It came up in I think it was episode 2 when we talked about Final Fantasy X-2, and I think it came up probably a few other times as well. It did in Final Fantasy Tactics, which we talked about there. First off, what do you think of the job system? Probably a bit of a broad question. And how do you think it's done here?
I really like the job system. I think it's one of those things that can be very restrictive, but it also can be really, really freeing. And it completely depends on the game that it's actually used in. Like, obviously, titles like 9, 10, and 4 specifically are the ones that really come to mind. Like, they're very, very rigid. If you don't have a specific role within your party, then you're very much bottlenecked from being able to utilize the full force of the job system, I suppose. But then you have things like 7 and 8, where you can effectively make any character into whatever you want. Sometimes their original starting stats will be different, which might inform you as to what role they would play well as. But really, it kind of just comes down to personal preference, in my opinion. Overall, I like the job system. I really, really like that every job has its own individual identity, has its own individual costume to go with it. Depending on what the story actually ends up being, they all fit very, very well into the actual world itself. As to whether or not 3 does it well, I think it does to an extent. We'll talk about this again, as you said, in a later episode when we discuss Final Fantasy V. I think the job system was better served there. I think the job system was much better served in Final Fantasy X too, which, as I've mentioned before, is one of my favorite battle systems and job systems in the entire franchise. I think it's partially, I don't look at it quite so favorably because of the way that 3 does its job changes. You can't just do it as and when you want to, unless you're playing the Pixel Remaster version, because as we've said before, all 3 of these games are technically very, very distinct. In the original version, there's something called capacity points. That's it. Originally, you cannot swap jobs unless you have enough capacity points, which you gain from battle. So if you don't like the class that you're in, tough shit, get back into battle, fight until you have enough points to be able to swap. In the DS version, it's not quite the same, but again, you're not able to just swap as and when you want. There are some requirements. In the Pixel Remaster, you can do whatever you want. There's no job restrictions whatsoever. I think if I'd played the DS version where I had that ability, I probably would think of it a little bit more favorably, but that's not what I started with, so it's not how I feel.
No, I totally get that, and I'm glad you answered that way, because I was going to allude to that as well and flash back to the point you made about the games all being very different. Of course, I realised that because I played the Pixel Remaster recently and was looking for a walkthrough. Again, this game's very, very difficult to play without a walkthrough. I mean, I think it's rpgsite.net. Does a great spoiler-free, just tells you every step to do walkthrough, which is really, really good. I agree. I think it's definitely the prototype for the job system that came later. So it's the weakest in that sense. But I mean, just to go on to what the job system is, effectively, each character has their own job, which performs a certain role, amplifies certain stats, I guess you could say, and also enables that character to have a specific command. You alluded to the fact there that with Final Fantasy VII, each character kind of has their own class, and then the materia system augments that. With Final Fantasy VIII, other than the limit breaks, each character is a blank slate. I think their stats all start the same. I'm not sure. But the magic and junction system there is what makes that infinitely more customizable. The job system in this game, yeah, it's a prototype. While playing this game, I played the Pixel Remaster, so I didn't have that capacity point issue. But going back to what I was saying there, looking for the walkthroughs, I noted that it was very difficult. I had to pick a Pixel Remaster walkthrough because otherwise there was a lot about make sure you got capacity before you do this, which would force you to grind a lot more. You do have to grind a lot in this game anyway, which I know is not a thing that you enjoy. But I remember thinking the fact I can change jobs on the fly is so much better. And if I wasn't able to do that, it probably would have frustrated me quite a lot because the problem with this game, and I say the problem with this game because I really enjoyed my experience playing this game. I've got a bit of a soft spot for it. It feels like it's a prototype, but knows it's a prototype. You know what I mean? I think because of the stuff we talked about with the story not being as ambitious as, say, 2, and they went for a very basic sort of story structure.
I think it's to actually build on that again, going back to those 30th anniversary interviews, and they were really, really fantastic. I highly recommend that you go and read them. Actually, they talked a little bit about why things were changed the way that they were in the remakes. I know that the battle supervisor and main planner said in one part of the interviews, this was specifically for the DS remake, they rejigged everything to make it more fair, which seasoned Final Fantasy III players will understand that the DS remake was not necessarily more fair and is sometimes considered the most difficult of all 3 iterations of the game, partially because of the rebalancing, partially because it remains as unforgiving with battle encounters as the original. Fuck that battle encounter.
You can turn it off in the Pixel Remaster mode.
Don't tempt
Which I
me.
did a lot. I did a lot.
They made the point that everyone who played, or pretty much everyone who played the Famicom version, ended up with 2 ninjas and 2 sages in their party because they were the strongest jobs.
No.
So it felt really unbalanced, and they changed that so that you don't have to go into the secret dungeon to acquire these jobs in the DS remake. Which they specifically wanted it to be that everyone, no matter what path they chose, could make it to the end of the game with any job. It didn't matter what you did, which I really, really respect as a design change. Going back to the original Final Fantasy III, and this is back with Tanaka again, he mentions that when they were coming up with the whole idea of the jobs, all of the ideas was collaborative notes, essentially. And this is just insane to me. Is I know that the modern day gaming process and like writing process is still very, very collaborative, but it really felt like it just was a combined notebook that everyone scribbled in, and then at some point they came back to and looked in like in a meeting and just went, yeah, we'll take that, that sucks, get it out of here. So as far as, job identity and stuff like that, he says we wanted to change the skill command and we came up with, things for each one, but there were some that we weren't sure about, like we stuck with. But the specific one that they highlighted was, why did we give jump to dragoons? Why the hell did we do that? He kind of thinks that maybe it was Ishii's vision, maybe like traditional dragoon mounted infantry and they're up in the sky, so maybe that was something to do with it, but they're not sure. So it kind of, again, it feels very prototypical. And I think because they were working with the knowledge that this is the end of the NES, they know the SNES is on the horizon, and they have a suspicion that, the previous games have done decently enough that they can continue working on this, and they're gonna push it, they're gonna try something new, which, as we've discussed before, Final Fantasy is fantastic for doing. Every single game does something new, and I will always respect them for that. So the fact that it doesn't feel polished completely makes sense to me.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you put it far more eloquently than me there. I mean, that point you made there about like, should we do that? No. Should we do that? Yes. It's kind of what I was alluding to there, is that the bits that are prototypical in this game are quite obviously prototypical, but the bits that they do that they get right that are deliberate. I mean, like, I don't know, I've got a hell of a soft spot for this game, especially now that I've played it. Now, when I was playing it through recently, bearing in mind that it only came out, I think, on the console I'm playing it on last year, 2023 was the Pixel Remaster on PS4/5. I went into it playing a modern experience or an updated experience, obviously with the Pixel remaster. But I was also very aware that I was playing an old game. I'm not going to say how old it is, just because you get upset with me when I do that. A game that's older than me. So I remember a few times being like, well, that's a little bit dated and frustrating. But then I went, hang on a minute, this is probably the first game that did this. You know what I mean? Like there's a few moments where it's like, I felt there's a few quality of life things that were like, oh, really? Do I have to do that? Like, I'll talk about an example. So, and this is very unique to this game. I don't remember any other Final Fantasy game that ever does this again, but there's a mechanic in this game where you can use Mini out of battle and turn your characters into tiny little versions of yourself and move and go into different areas. It happens a lot in the first half of this game. You go into like 3 dungeons. It was one dungeon you have to go in as toads, I think.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about that is that every time you do it, you have to go and cast Mini on each character. And if you have not got enough MP for that, it's a bit of frustrating having to go to the pool and reset your MP and then go through and make sure you're small to go through the cavern. It's a little bit of a ball ache, let's put it that way. But I remember doing that and thinking, oh God, why have I got to do this again? And I thought, well, hang on a minute, this was the first time they did anything like this. So I'm going to let them off. And I felt a lot like that playing this game. The frustrations that I endured while playing it, I kind of went, oh, you know what, whatever, fine. They did the best they could with the technology they had. And at the time, this would have been, probably acceptable because it would be the first time it was introduced.
I think that's exactly the right perspective to come in and play Final Fantasy III as like a modern gamer. I know I mentioned this back in our Final Fantasy IV episode, but that was when they were starting to really find their feet and really figure out what they wanted to do and how they wanted to do it. And like you just said, it's not like these were cliches back in the day. They are now, the heroine being the white mage, that kind of all started with Rosa. You don't get stuff like that prior to. It didn't exemplify that specific role. So the fact that FF3 actually has all of these little stumbling blocks, it can be very, very, very frustrating. But I think it's really important that people playing this game, especially for the first time and in this age, and obviously in the years in the future as well, it's really important to bear in mind that this wasn't the norm. People were trying to just figure out what they wanted to do.
Totally agree. And I'll add to that with a game design perspective. Final Fantasy III gives you a set of jobs you can get. And every time you beat a crystal boss, you get access to a few more jobs. Now, the game is not that good at hinting to you what job to use next. It kind of lets you have an open palette of what you want to do. Now, in the Pixel Remaster, where you don't get penalized for changing jobs, it makes it a little bit more accessible because you can change the jobs on the fly. Because there are certain parts of the game which are almost impossible to do without a specific job.
God, yeah.
Do you know what particular boss I'm going to talk about now?
I can think of 2 different ones.
Right. Well, the one that stuck out for me when I was playing it, which was making me shout at the screen, was Garuda in Saronia Castle.
Yes, that's the one that fucked me off the most as well.
Yeah. So Garuda in Saronia Castle. Garuda, at this point in the game, Garuda, I think it hits you with an area of effect wind attack, which just wipes your party out. Effectively, the way to beat it is to turn everyone into a dragoon and get them to jump, and then take it out before it can hit you with the area effect attack. Because the first 4 or 5 turns, it doesn't use that ability. So it's a puzzle. And kind of like going back to the point I was making before.
It's a puzzle that fucking sucks.
Yeah. Well, this game feels a lot more like a puzzle game, right? Final Fantasy V is like a puzzle game, but it's a puzzle game you can solve multiple different ways. This game, there's only really one solution for a lot of it. You alluded to the fact that you've got to do the optional dungeon to get the ninja to stand a chance of beating the final boss. That's kind of what they wanted you to do. Beating it another way is very, very tricky. That is a really frustrating part. What's annoying about it is that you have to talk to NPCs to get hints about becoming a dragoon, and you have to go and speak to other people and find some gear. And you'll go into a room and find loads of gear that, oh, hang on, this is dragoon gear. Maybe I should be a dragoon and try that. That's the hint you get in game. Now, what's frustrating about that is I looked up a guide and said, oh, you need to be a dragoon to do this, and then bought all the gear and then realized there was free gear lying around.
Oh, no.
Another frustrating thing is you need lots of gil in this game, and you've got to grind to get the gil. So it's lots of bottlenecking. A lot of the bosses sort of follow the same pattern of like they hit you with an area effect attack and you've got to use something to fight back at them. That's the one that I remember sticking out to me. It's so satisfying when you beat it, though. I mean, that's so cool as well, throwing loads of dragoons at the boss and hammering it.
We at EXP Required have never talked about how much we love dragoons before.
Yeah, we love some dragoons. I mean, there's another point, I think, later on where you go to Falgabard or whatever.
Falgabard, yeah.
It's an optional town, and there's a little cave there. And the locals explain the sort of phenomenon of if you go in that cave, you've got to fight whatever, and you've got to fight a certain way. So if you go into the cave and you hit it with a normal sword, the enemies duplicate. But if you use Dark Knight abilities, it doesn't happen. So that there's a few little things like that happen in this game quite a lot, and it sort of pushes you down a path of using a specific job. But like I say, it's limiting because you have to use that specific job. It didn't take away from me too much for the game experience because, like you say, in the Pixel Remaster, you're not penalised for swapping jobs on the fly. The only really penalisation you get is the fact that you have to go and then buy more gear for every character if you're going to turn them all into Dark Knights. A little bit frustrating, but I get what they were going for.
So you've mentioned frustrations there about not having Gil, and you're entirely right. This is one of those games where you need to be a fucking gillionaire to be able to get anywhere in life. Do you know what the most frustrating thing for me personally was in this game? I think I've talked about this in a previous episode, but I can't remember where.
Well, I know you don't like grinding, so presumably it's grinding.
It's not grinding. Final Fantasy III is very, very unique in that there is a set limit of Phoenix Downs that they give you in this game. And nothing has ever pissed me off more than learning that, because unless you are able to revive people with a healing job, so that would be the White Mage or the Devout, and you run out of Phoenix Downs, you are fucked. You are shit out of luck. To the point where I've never been afraid to use Phoenix Downs in other games because you could just buy them at a shop. They're like, what, 100 gil? They're fucking everywhere. Oh, FF3 had me terrified every single time a single character whiffed it in battle, because it's like, this is no longer like a fun game. This is now an exercise in like, how do I not have the last couple of hours wasted? Something else that Final Fantasy III is, it's not necessarily unique for having, but it sticks out for me the most, and you will understand in a minute. The original 3 Final Fantasies didn't have save points the way that we know them today. You weren't able to save anywhere but in the field. There weren't points inside towns or dungeons that you could save at and rest your game. This changed with Final Fantasy IV, which introduced save points in dungeons. Final Fantasy III, however, does not have save points in dungeons. Now, the approach to the final boss takes you through a building known as the Crystal Tower. I don't remember quite how many floors this thing has, but it's kind of a slog. It's a hell of a dungeon to get through. All of the enemies are really, really tough because it's the final dungeon area. And then you get to the final boss and you're like, yeah, excellent, right. I've almost finished the game. Do me a favor, Jack. Pretend you're me for a minute. Pretend you're me. And it's 2007, and you really just want to finish FF3, and you make it into the final boss area, and you've been playing for a couple of hours, and you're doing really, really well at fighting the final boss. And then your White Mage dies, and then another character dies, and then another character dies, and then you get the game over screen, and all you can think is, that was 3 hours of my life.
Yep.
I've never finished Final Fantasy III because the Cloud of Darkness absolutely mopped the floor with me in that final battle, and I was so pissed that I never touched that game again. I think it was maybe about 5 years later, I was like, you know what? Try again. I'm going to start from the beginning. I got into the first battle of the game, and the music just made me think of that absolute monstrosity of a battle, and I got so pissed that I turned it off again. Final Fantasy III is one of those ones that, as much as I think this is a really interesting game to talk about, as much as it's a really, really good game, one of the most frustrating experiences of my entire life.
I tell you what, if I hadn't played the Pixel Remaster, I could completely see where you're coming from. Because my experience of it has been tainted or untainted by that. Yes, okay, the Pixel Remaster gets rid of those annoyances somewhat, but the last dungeon is still a fucking nightmare. Yeah. And you can't save in the last dungeon. Yeah. You can save you get the quick save function that happens on the Pixel Remaster. So if you die,
you lucky bastard, you don't know how good you've had it all this time.
Yeah, I know, because basically, you are right, the way it's designed, you can only save on the world map, and you have to go through the entire dungeon. The game's designed that way because I think it was I can't remember what the penultimate dungeon's called, like a maze, I think it's called, and then you go into the Crystal Tower after that. There's like a little bit of land on the world map before that, so that's the last time you can save before you go into the Crystal Tower. And then you go into the optional dungeon and stuff like that, and then you can go into the final world, which is the world of darkness. Yes. And it's again another puzzle where you've got to find the 4 warriors of dark and then fight not the 4 fiends, but the equivalent of the 4 fiends, to be able to weaken the heart of darkness, weaken the cloud of darkness before you can fight the cloud of darkness.
Yeah,
I think I mentioned before about the Cloud of Darkness being this legendary hard boss. Lots of people talked about it on forums about how hard it was and how much of a nightmare it was. Now, a lot of people never have beaten the game because of the very same thing you described there, because it is a fucking nightmare. Even with the quality of life additions in the Pixel Remaster, you treat each dungeon as a puzzle. Again, it goes back to the D&D design, doesn't it? You know,
Yeah.
you can, I don't know if you can teleport out of dungeons, but I know I spent a lot of time in the last part of the game turning encounters off, walking back through the last dungeon to the world map, and then grinding for a bit before I went back. And then I went, you know what?
Right.
I'm not going to go back in because I know that I haven't quite got enough to beat those 4 monsters and then beat the final boss as well. I know that the idea in that final dungeon is that you beat those 4 bosses, and then they slightly weaken the cloud of darkness before you fight it. Now, you can, at that point, have your HP and MP restored at those crystals. I don't know if that only features in the Pixel Remaster, which made it playable and winnable, because otherwise you'd have to spend even more time grinding and getting enough elixirs to be able to make sure everyone's back to a certain health. And like you said as well, with the Phoenix Downs as well, it's a flipping nightmare. And this game as well, from memory, bearing in mind it's a bit of time ago now I played it, if you heal without your party members being alive in like an inn, they don't come back to life.
No, they don't.
No, so it's really, really annoying. So I don't know if the Pixel Remaster goes away with the limit on Phoenix Downs, but certainly I remember being limited by the amount of the fact that you can't heal if you just go into an inn. You know what I mean? It's really
It's good to know that there's still a level of challenge. Like, I still think it's a bullshit level of challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I think what they've done with the Pixel Remaster is they've changed just enough to make it so it's still frustrating, but frustrating in all the right ways. I think. The game is still it's a dungeon crawler at heart, where you're supposed to beat the whole dungeon as a whole thing, as opposed to beat a bit of it, come back, beat a bit of it, come back, beat a bit of it, come back. That's the idea of it. But, you know, it would have been nice for them to let you know that before you went in and spent hours of your life wasting. You know, it's another thing that's a bit frustrating. I mean, I'm talking from a position of love for this game, because I did like really enjoy my time playing it. I had a smile on my face a lot of it. A lot of it was probably because of the fact that the soundtrack, I think, is brilliant. I think it's one of the better soundtracks in Final Fantasy. Having said that, I think it's mainly good when you're playing the game.
Yes.
I wouldn't say I would listen to much of this outside of the game like I would with, say, 8, 9, or 7 soundtrack.
No, I agree with you, actually. Yeah. It is a wonderful experience that really does augment the world, and there's a lot of tracks that are really fitting for the areas that they're used in. I don't know if it's a case of the tracks themselves are just too short or too repetitive or anything like that, but it's not something that I can listen to on its own. And this is coming from someone who pretty much does nothing but listen to Final Fantasy soundtracks. So the fact that I'm saying that is kind of significant.
There's also a little quirk on the Pixel Remaster where the battle music is different of your mini.
I do remember hearing about that.
That's really, really cute addition.
One thing I do want to mention about the soundtrack specifically is that there are as many soundtracks as there are iterations of the game. There is the original soundtrack for the Famicom version. Obviously, they didn't keep that for the DS version. It was updated. It was a really nice interpretation of the original Famicom version, I thought. Listening to them side by side, they are exactly the same melodies, but they sound appropriate for the medium that they've actually been put in. And then again, for the Pixel Remaster, they were done again. Now, I've listened to the Pixel Remaster soundtrack. I don't like it as much as I liked the DS version, actually. It became really rocky for some reason.
Yeah, it is very rocky. Yeah, which I liked.
I didn't grab me.
I mean, again, I've not really listened to the DS version, so I can't compare which one I prefer. But I did quite like the rocky style of it. I know that Nobuo was involved with the development of the Pixel Remaster soundtrack. One thing on the soundtrack that's quite interesting, and I found this out earlier, and this is something that might be lost to time as well. We talked about the development of the game technically on the Famicom and how it pushed the hardware. If you were to listen to the prelude at the beginning of this game and compare it to the prelude in the beginning of Final Fantasy 1, you will notice a massive difference. You might not notice a massive difference if you listen to some modern music comparing it to that. But if you listen to those two side by side, you will notice there is a lot more they do, or the sound team or Nobuo did with the hardware. A lot more percussion in the original version. I think, to me, it's a bit shrill to listen to along with the game, so I changed to the Pixel Remaster soundtrack. I think, actually, just knowing the fact that I did just say that I liked the Rocky soundtrack, I was a little bit torn at first because I wanted to have a more authentic experience, and I would say that the Pixel Remaster's soundtrack isn't as authentic, ironically, as the rest of the game is, and it probably would have been suited to be more like the DS's soundtrack that I've heard. The bits of it that I have heard. So I do agree with you in that sense, but I do like it. I think it grew on me, and the battle themes, it worked really, really well. I think the Rocky stuff, it was quite...
I thought the battle themes were the bit that it jumped out the most
really?
out for me.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
But
I think one of the things that's really specifically interesting before we move on about the actual soundtrack being like updated for whichever iteration of consoles that it's come out on. I do remember reading, and this is years and years ago, so you'll have to forgive me for not providing a source for this one, but I do remember reading that, like, with every remake that was done and every compositional piece that Uematsu worked on, it enabled him to create the piece that he originally wanted to create. So I kind of always try to look at these updated soundtracks as like, okay, well, this is Uematsu's original vision in a manner of speaking. Whether or not I feel we should have the actual idea of what he wanted to create, or if we should just stick with the limitations and like have that as the final product, that's a completely different argument that I think we could probably go back and forth on for years if necessary. But I thought that was something worth bringing up, just the idea of like, no, maybe this is actually what he wanted all along. He wanted to do his rock orchestra and he finally got his chance. Congratulations, Uematsu.
he's a rocker at heart, though, isn't he?
Yeah, he
Uematsu.
is.
I mean, it's interesting on that. I mean, I slightly, very tangentially, talking about musicians approaching music again. I know I told you before, I'm a big fan of the band The Who, and there's an album they produced in the 70s called Quadrophenia, which was pushing quadraphonic sound, which was the precursor to 5.1. And the idea is the instrument would come out of 4 channels and stuff like that. It would be varied. I know that when they revisited the music for the soundtrack that came out a few years later, the bass player, John Entwistle, added extra tracks to it because he was unhappy with how his sound originally was. Now, that's him being a perfectionist, or whatever the term would be, having high standards, I guess. But of course, I don't like their redone version because it doesn't sound like I remember it. And a lot of fans feel the same. But of course, you can't improve on perfection, I think is a phrase that you've used before in this podcast. I think that it's good to be able to flip back between the two. An option, the Pixel Remaster to flick, like you say, with the DS soundtrack might have made it an interesting stopgap. Again, like I say, I've not really listened to the DS soundtrack that much. So, but from what I've heard of the intro music and stuff like that and the world map theme, I think I've heard probably would work quite well, I'd imagine. At least give the people the option, you know what I mean? Like I said, it is a bit ironic that they've gone for an almost faithful adaptation of the original game with a few changes, but then
bring in the electric guitars.
Yeah, totally. Let's just put some. Yeah, totally. That sounds cool. You can see him smirking when he did it, though. Bless him. Before we move on, then I'm just going to harken back to what I was saying before. It's the right time to talk about this now, I think, because I talked about the fan translation from before, and there's a README file with this translation. Do you remember README files?
I do. Jesus Christ, that brings me back.
Now, README files, for anyone that doesn't know what README files are basically what came with software back in the day. Is a README, so you click on it to open your software and understand what's going on with it. Back in the early days of computing and stuff like that, when everything didn't work as much and you had to tweak things to your settings of your own computer. Thank God we got away with that, sort of. Now, the README file for this fan translation, there's loads of notable quotes. Obviously, it acts as a micro manual and a way of explaining the jobs, which notably in the game does not exist. There is no explanation of the job system in game here. This gives you nothing to work with. You just get this blank slate, crack on, here's the keys, go on with it.
Very emblematic of the early Final Fantasies. Yeah. We're not going to tell you shit, just go have fun.
But this README is fabulous because it's there's a few notable quotes in it. So it's got the jobs listed, and it goes for Onion Kid. And they've written here, these guys are completely useless. It's just literally all it says about them, which is funny considering the fact that I know there are challenge runs of people trying to beat this game as Onion Knights or Onion Kids. So every time it goes into almost make a spoiler, I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong, so please correct me if I'm wrong. It says, Sori wa Himitsu Desu, which is Japanese for that is a secret.
Yeah.
It's a quote from a character called Zelos or Zerosu from the Slayers light novel, manga, and anime. Now, it's just fascinating how like that was popular at the time, or presumably the people that made this were a fan of that. So you can see this little bit of history in this thing from 1999, which has like them use basically they go in to say how the job system works, and every time they go, if you need to know more, this is a secret. So there's basically like a spoiler tag where they say for Sore wa Hamitsu Desu. Yeah, so that's I thought that was really cool. It made me laugh. They've written here as well against the White Wizards, casts White Magic, Natch, which is just so funny. The translation gives the skills of the scholar as a peep to look into what, because the scholar is like can look at what the character's looking at. I don't know what it is in the actual version. I can't remember, but peep sounds amazing. Scan to tell you the elemental weak point. Now, I think it's Libra in the translation I played.
on the Final Fantasy wiki that the original Famicom version is Scan and Peep. The
Oh, right.
3D version's command ability is Study and support ability is Item Lore. And then in the Pixel remaster, those are translated as Study and Alchemy.
Right. Of course, you're probably seeing Peep and Scan from that translation. That's really interesting. So against that, we've got Dragoons. Against that, they've got Jump is nearly essential to defeat one major villain. That's what they've written against it. They've got Karateka, which I think is black belt. Obviously, karate is probably the link there.
Yeah.
Build up causes him to power up Dragon Ball Z style. They've written that. That wasn't me. I've quoted Dragon Ball Z. I know I've gone down there, but that was just a quote from a README file. The Dark Knight is called the Mystic Knight in this game, which is interesting. Very interesting, considering the fact that Mystic Knight is a class later. Now, summoning magic, and we'll talk about this a little bit more. Do you know what the quirk with summoning magic is in this game? Because I didn't until I read this README file.
Oh, okay. So I don't know if I'm 100%. I don't know if this was something that was actually scrapped or not. But as far as I recall, every single summon actually has two or three different ways that they can appear, I suppose.
Yep.
So there's a black magic incarnation, there's a white magic incarnation, and then there's a maybe something else incarnation. I don't recall. Probably a support.
That is correct. So this is the first time we have summoning magic. We'll talk about it a bit more in a minute when we get into the story stuff. But yeah, you're right in what you say that there are multiple, depending on what your job, depends on what the summon does, which I think is fascinating, right? So an example, because I think it might be the case for each summon, maybe not all of them, but if a white mage uses Bahamut, then Aura is cast, or it's actually haste in this game. It has the same effect as haste. The black mage summoning Bahamut uses Rend, which gruesomely kills one enemy, and the summoner casts Mega Flare. Now, by the point in the story you've got Bahamut, I'd be using a summoner anyway, so I didn't know that you could do those two other abilities, which is really, really cool. Now, there is another game, and it's the first time I've mentioned it this episode, and I'm going to mention it because I do it every time, that has a similar quirk to do with summoning magic. Do you know which one it is?
Within the franchise or outside of it?
Within Final Fantasy franchise. And you might not know about it, because I didn't learn about it until earlier in the year.
I want to say Final Fantasy VI, but I don't think that's right.
Right, well, Final Fantasy IX has a quirk with Carbuncle. The mechanic in that game is that the summoning magic is taught through magical stones. You give them to two characters in the game, and they can learn the summons through those stones. I think it's Eiko, or Aiko, however you pronounce her name, learns Carbuncle, which is traditionally the character which gives you a buff and casts Reflect on your party. The Ruby is the stone which teaches you Ruby Light, which is that ability. If you've learned Carbuncle and you have a Sapphire, I think, connected to your ability, it will give you a different buff. It will give you Protect on all your characters, or it will give you stuff. Yeah, so I don't know what, I think there's another one as well, but basically if you have a different stone equipped, once you've learned the ability, you get a different buff and it casts a different ability, which I didn't know until this year.
Well, I didn't know that until just now. That's cool.
So actually, it reminded me of that, because of course I only found this out through the README, because like you said earlier, like once you get the Pixel remaster, goes back to the fact that you need to get the ninja job in the additional dungeon at the end of the game, and by that point I'm using sages, and I only knew they could summon the monster that way as opposed to the black mage or white mage way. So that's only through reading stuff did I find something out about the game.
Literacy is important, kids.
Yeah.
So one thing that I do think is really interesting about the summon stuff in this game is we've talked a little bit about the battle stuff and how individual jobs have like their own flinching animation. But the original battle screen was still held on like a black background with a strip of whichever environment that you're on, so you kind of know whereabouts you are. Pretty similar to the original two games' battle screens. One thing that I found really interesting was learning, I think this is again from Ishii, when they were designing the battle system, they had to think really carefully about like how they were actually going to, I guess, show off all these battle sprites on screens, if they were going to have a background, if they weren't going to have a background. And it was the summoner job that actually led them to having a black background. Do you know why?
I don't.
This is a case of they realized that they would have had to like redo so much work for every single case of sprite work. It's because of Odin. Odin's Zantetsuken ability, when he slashes things in half, causes the two sprites to split and move aside from each other. Now, if they were going to do that with a background, they would have had to do that for every single background, and it probably wouldn't have looked fantastic. But since they could have just a black background, they didn't need to worry about the way that the sprites would look when they were like sliding apart, which is why those battle backgrounds have stayed the way that they have. Incidentally, do you know which summon was first designed?
Ooh. I know the first one you get is Chocobo. Is it Chocobo?
It's not. Technically, the very first summon that was designed was Odin. And I believe it was like Odin actually contributed quite a lot to the way that they were going to do the battle screen. So that must have come from very, very early on in
God, they did it first, eh?
yeah. Something else that's really interesting is that a lot of the original names for these summons all have different like translations. And again, I think this is originally because of like limitations for how many like letters you could actually have on the screen. So some of these are a little understandable. Like you have Leviathan for Leviathan. Some of them are like, why did you do it that way? You have Bahamut instead of Bahamut. And then some of them are just completely random. Do you know what Odin's name is sometimes referred to as?
I don't know, but I remember noticing it in the game and thinking, what on earth am I reading?
Fucking Catastro.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, Catastro. Yeah,
brilliant.
Not, just for everyone listening, it doesn't say fucking in the game. It's just Catastro, not just. Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? I totally noticed that and thought, what? Like, why have they got different names? So,
but yeah, I just thought that the sprite work like was so important to the overall way that this game was actually produced, and it sounds like from the very beginning that 3 is one of those games that no matter how you talk about it, I feel like at some point you have to discuss the job system. Everyone does anyway, because it is like, first and foremost and very important. But the fact that we keep coming back to this, you can't defeat certain bosses without these things in your party. You can't enter and do damage in this town without a Dark Knight. You can't do this, you can't do that. Like, the battle system is just so front and center important that I'm not really too sure we've actually really seen that in another game since.
I read something the other day, and again, I don't know a source for this because I think it might have been like a Reddit post or something. I think there's been speculation in the past about someone noting that every time a Final Fantasy alternates, that one time it focuses on story, the next time it focuses on the mechanics, the next time it focuses on story. I think one of the developers was approached with that, and he said, what are you talking about? That's never been the case. But I think in the early games, that works because you know, your first game was the first game that was like it. Second game was story based. The third game was very mechanic based. Fourth game was highly story based. And then the fifth game kind of does both. And then, of course, Final Fantasy VI throws it all out the window. And then, of course, so it probably adds to, because I've been thinking a lot about Final Fantasy IX while I've been playing the older games for the podcast. Everyone talks about how Final Fantasy IX is a look over the shoulders. You can't stop me talking about Final Fantasy IX, by the way.
I'm not even going to try.
Final Fantasy IX, I get more of an appreciation for the more I play these older titles, because it's like a look over the shoulders to the last 8 games in the series. But actually, it's mainly the first 5 games in the series. And I felt an awful lot of, I mean, you mentioned about that little quirk there with the summoning magic. This game sort of felt a lot more like 9 than I thought. I remember that we'll get into it in a minute when we talk about the story. But the first 5 games are their own set. I mean, the Pixel Remaster has the first 6 games, but 6 is when I think the series really found its identity and all of those things fleshed together and came in. Obviously, we love 4. It stands out in those first 5 games. I think it's pretty much argued that we'd agree that 4 of those first 5 games is the best one. Yeah. But I think the first 5 games are kind of the prototypes in a sense. It's where they were throwing things at the wall.
No, I'll agree with you on that.
And I think that 9 harkens back to those first 5 more than it does 6, 7, 8. I think it does refer to bits in 6. It's almost like there's a few little Easter eggs for 6, 7, and 8. But from certainly
not as primarily.
Certainly playing 3 and 5 through recently, there are so many story beats and so many different things where I'm like, oh my god, like this is like they've sat and played these games and specifically looked at those 2 in particular. I think more than anything, actually. Okay, so now we've spoken about that, we'll have a quick break and be back in a minute and talk about the game's story and other stuff. Okay, so after that rather long break, I make that joke every time. It's never really funny, is it? Yeah, no. It's not. Wow. Okay. After that really short break. No, so what I want to mention very, very briefly on the summoning magic, because I'd like to talk a bit more the story in this game. What story, I hear you ask, is that there is a town called Doga's Village. There's a town called Doga's Village. There's something wrong there. I want to say that. There's a village called Doga's Village, which you get by, and basically you go underwater in the submarine and come back over and up onto the land, and then you can get to Doga's Village. I think it's an optional location where you can buy some of the summoning magic for the game and some high-level spells as well. What's interesting about the summoning magic and how it ties into the narrative is it's quite limited, but it does a little bit. Now, this is the first time summons were in a Final Fantasy game. I don't know if it's the first time summons were in a game. It'd be interesting to see, actually. It may have appeared in some of the Dragon Quest stories, but certainly this is the one where you can first summon beasts or monsters and things like that. I take it you don't know how the summons tie into the narrative at all.
I have no idea, actually.
Right. So not really the narrative, but very, very briefly, you can go to a town called Duster, the Bard town. So you can get a lot of the Bard musical stuff in there. And if you go around the fountain area, There's loads of little bars, and they will tell you about the different monsters and different summons you can get in the game. So one of them hints at you about Odin and how he lives in a castle, and one of them hints at you about Leviathan and how he lives in a cave, and one of them hints at you about Bahamut and how he lives under a mountain. It's very, very loose, but I think it's quite interesting how it's basically a mechanical hint. There's actually a monster you can go and summon, and it's done through song, which I think is quite cool, actually. It's probably as scraping the surface as you can get as it tying into the narrative of the game, because it doesn't really... I don't think you have to... do you have to get any summons in this game?
I don't think so.
I don't think you do. I think you just get them naturally, and most of them are optional. So I think, like I said, the three there that I remember specifically were Odin in his castle, and then, of course, Leviathan in, I think it's the Leviathan cave, and then Bahamut on his, I think it's his mountain as well. On that, we have to mention there about getting a submarine. What's notable about this game is that the methods of transportation you get in it. So this is the first time you can go underwater. You can also use loads of airships. You keep getting an airship and then losing it, which is quite frustrating.
I hate when that happens, don't you?
Yeah, when you lose your airship, yeah, it's ridiculous. And I think, like I say, the first airship you get is like a little puzzle with it on the world map, where you need the airship to cross over a little lake, and then you can't get it back to it because you go through the cave and come back, and then you need to get a canoe to get the airship again. And then you connect the airship to a ram and it breaks against the thing. But the first few airships you get can't go over mountains. There's one that can go over mountains, which is the Invincible. Right. And the Invincible mountain hops, and you need it to get over certain things in the game. You can go to different optional locations. And I know in the Pixel remaster, I don't know how detailed it is in the original version, but there are quote unquote puzzles on the world map in this game because of that. So you get the issue where you need to break through a boulder and you use a ram on the side of the airship. And also Leviathan, you can see swimming around like a pool. So it's like a hint when you fly past it. Oh, I can get that monster. So I quite like that element of game design. If you've got an optional thing that you can use something later to get, and how you have actual characters in the game hinting about getting it. Again, it's very prototypical. It's not bad. It's just there, but it's not strong either, because there's no need to get any summons in this game whatsoever. So
I cannot think of a single person that I know that's played this game that ever had a summoner in their party when they got to the final boss.
I think I did, actually, because I like Mega
Did you have
Flare.
a summoner or did you have a sage?
Oh, sorry, a sage. Yeah, but your sage can use... Right, no, you don't get a summoner in the party, no. And I think as well, just to point out, there's a few jobs in this game which are very situational. I mean, which we talked about the Dragoon. I mean, there's nothing wrong with keeping the Dragoon in the party. There's nothing wrong with keeping the Dark Knight in the party. But the Scholar just has this job to look at what the flipping other party's doing, which becomes like a command later on, doesn't it? Or it becomes a spell later on. It's a bit weak. I mean, I get it. There's like a hint. I think someone gives you a hint earlier on that says, oh, by the way, a Scholar can give you a hint on what this monster can do. And there's an awful lot of reskinning of bosses in this game. We talked before about how a lot of them will do an area of effect attack of their particular element, which makes the game a lot more of an elemental game in a sense. But they also have this ability that a lot of them will do, which is like, I think it's like a change guard or something like that, I think it's called, where they are
bane of my fucking life.
Bane of your life, because the idea is that they're like weak to thunder 1 minute. The next minute they're then weak to blizzard or whatever. And the idea is you're supposed to use a Scholar to work out what their weakness is. Not implemented very well at all, because again, you have to keep one person as a Scholar and keep on top of what that other thing's doing, which is really
it's like the
frustrating.
only thing that they can do in those battles.
Annoying. And of course, when you get into Final Fantasy V, you can have that particular thing as I think it's a command the White Mage has or Time Mage has or something like that. So it's a lot better. That's probably the biggest misstep from the mechanical perspective I think this game's made, because that job is really redundant. But yeah, no, from a story perspective, this game is very, very loose.
Yes, and there is a reason for that.
Okay, what's the reason?
Because Final Fantasy II was more story heavy. Squaresoft was actually being quite reactive in this case, and they thought they were being too story heavy with 2, so they decided to roll it back and focus more on the game mechanic stuff, which I think was really interesting, because you can tell that they were still definitely trying stuff out, as we've said before, but you wouldn't have thought that the story would be something that would be sacrificed in order to try something different.
No, but what I will say, and I think this is where we might disagree a little bit here, I think that the way they've done this, I'm not going to say it's the best, because it certainly isn't the best story. It's very, I wouldn't say it's weak. It's very loose and very, very prototypical. It's one of the best ways they've managed to tell a certain story a certain way. Now, I'll explain that. So last time we spoke about Final Fantasy 15. Now, what Final Fantasy 15 does is it has 4 core characters, and the story is told through the people they meet. This is the same as that. But I think this is done better than Final Fantasy 15, is what I'm saying. So I know that Final Fantasy 5 does that as well, and basically tries to tell its story through its supporting characters. I don't think the supporting characters are strong in that game. the main characters come back and help you at the end of the game, which was really, really cool because it shows your influence upon them throughout the story. It's something that Final Fantasy 15 would have benefited from. Because the way they've told that story is you've got your sort of 4 core characters, and it's very, very difficult to tell a story between 4 characters that are together the whole time. They tried in Final Fantasy 15 to have one come off and come back. It didn't work that well, which we discussed in the past. In this one, I presume, not having played the DS version or PSP version, that most of the story beats between the 4 unique characters that are created for that game don't have many things like that other than maybe banter that shows their personalities a little bit. They don't have any, like, one of them doesn't run off on their own and change the narrative of the story. The story is told The story is told through these extra characters. So you've got Princess Sarah that you need to rescue from a cave at the beginning of the game. What I liked about Princess Sarah is that you go and try and rescue her. She's like, no, I can help. I don't need your help. I'm fine. Love that. Also, Sid follows you around as well a little bit. I love Sid's design with the Santa-looking beard. I think it's really cute. I think this is the first, well, certainly the first Final Fantasy where the characters follow you around on the world map and around towns. They actually follow you, Final Fantasy 8 style.
I really, really liked that, actually, like especially with the DS chibi models as well, because they are very, very cute. It was really cute. Nice, like having a little duckling following me around.
Totally. And then, of course, it's something that came back in, well, it certainly was in Pokemon Yellow version with Pikachu following you around. And I think later versions of Pokemon where the Pokemon follows you around. It'd be interesting at some point to dive into whether this was the first game that did that. I don't know. But yeah, no, a character in the game called Arya dies and stays dead as well. Or gets killed. But probably the weakest part of the narrative is there's a character called Desh who apparently dies and then just comes back to life without any explanation.
That one took me by surprise as well when I was playing it the first time.
There's a few, like, some of the beats at the point have been set up in 2 where lots of the characters just die. The only character that dies and stays dead is Arya in this game.
For those listening, Desh doesn't just die, quote unquote. Man jumps off of a platform into a fucking volcano, which is why his coming back is so surprising.
Yeah, it's so out of left field. Like, I think it's because they need... So the idea is at the end of the game, I think there's 5 dragons that they've got to fight, and there's the 4 warriors are like there and can't handle them. They have to go and take on the final boss. And Doga and Une call in people you've met over your story to help. One of them's Princess Sarah, one's Prince Alice, or King Alice, I think, at this point. One's Sid, and one's Desh. I think they were just scraping for the final one. Or who can we bring back to life out of Arya and Desh? I know, we'll bring Desh back to life. Of course, it gives him a conclusion as well. Weird character choice as well. Like, his girlfriend's pining for him in a village.
Is he still a womanizer in the Pixel remaster?
I don't remember that specifically. There might be like a quick like note
right, because he's like noted to be a bit flirtatious in the DS remake.
All I remember from reading the story here is that you go into the town where you meet this girl and she's depressed that he's left. And then you go and find him, and then he sort of sacrifices himself, and it's seen as this noble thing. And then he comes back to life randomly, and she's like, "Don't ever leave me again." It's like, "Oh, okay, sorry." And it's very very popcorn, sugary sweet.
The writing is really not Final Fantasy III's strongest point.
Whereas I think that the Arya sacrifice is pretty good, but of course that doesn't mean anything in the narrative because Arya doesn't come back at the end. There's no mention of her again, so it's got all the pieces of Lego. It just hasn't put it together particularly well. I do think, however, though, here there's a narrative, just to spoil the game somewhat. You meet various people along the way, and then at the end of the game, they come back and help you. I really like that. What you're seeing is the Warriors of Light through the lens of how they've affected the world they've gone round.
For lack of a better term, it's very Final Fantasy, actually.
Very. And I think that's, I don't know whether you call that story or game design. Probably the main story beat that's worth mentioning is basically the main villain in this game, Xandi, is crap. Like, I'm sorry, just put it out there.
No, he's a terrible villain.
Terrible villain. What I will point out is that the idea is that you've got Une, Doga, and Xandi are like all students of, I think it's Noah?
Yes. Yeah. The Archmagus Noah.
They're like, the 3 disciples, should we say. And the idea is that Xandi's branched off and become the evil one. I get confused.
There is a reason.
Oh, yeah, a reason because he's mortal, isn't he? He's cursed with being mortal and he's bitter about it. Whereas the other 2, one of them is asleep for ages. I think, is it Une that's asleep or is it Doga that's asleep? I can never remember which one.
It's Une who is asleep. Now the thing is that Noah, who was a famous sage in his time, and God knows when this time was, like 1,000 years in the past or something, presumably on his deathbed, he actually passed down certain gifts to his disciples. Dorga and Une were both given magical powers. Dorga was given like extreme magical power, and I think it's kind of implied that it's his doing that actually created a lot of the magic and like later magics that you can buy from stores and stuff like that. Meanwhile, Une has access to the dream world essentially, but because time has been stopped within the world when we get to her, she's been in a coma for however fucking long.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Noah gifted Xande mortality, and Xande was so pissed by this that he froze time by disrupting the balance of light and dark. Now, I agreed with you before that Xande is a crap villain, and I do agree. I think the worst villain in this is the Cloud of Darkness, because in a very Final Fantasy way, it's a big thing with very unscrutable desires that just kind of comes out of nowhere. Xande's desire to not fucking die, I actually get that. I don't think it's a terrible character trait. I just don't think it was implemented very well.
It was improved much later when they did it again in Final Fantasy IX, because the parallel here is that Kuja didn't want to die because he was mortal and then goes to accidentally destroy the world or whatever he doesn't accidentally destroy the world. And then, of course, Necron comes out, which is the allegory to the Cloud of Darkness. And everyone's the same with Necron, like, what the fuck is Necron?
Yeah.
My point about Xande being a crap villain, he's not your foe.
No.
He's Doga and Une's foe. Again, it's a bit mixed because I like what they were going for, because he's got a reason to be upset. But I think it's how he's served up to you in the story that's not very good. There's a few...
He's barely in it.
He's barely in it, and that's who the actual fuck is he? The minor antagonists earlier in the game are better. Now, Gutsko is a more developed villain. This is the one where you have to cast Mini on yourself to get into these subterranean lake in Dwarven Hollows. Mm-hmm. After he's stolen one of the two horns from the dwarves, and after you beat him, he appears to die, but actually follows you out of the shadows and then steals both horns. You then follow him to the fire crystal and he turns into Salamander, which is, I think, the first boss that has that area of effect bullshit we talked about before. There's also a part later on in Saronia where King Gorn stabs his son in the middle of the night.
Little things.
And it turns out that he's controlled by Gigamets, who morphs into Garuda. Now, I think Gigamets might be linked to Xande in some way, but Xande has no link to these characters. They're just random people you meet. Now, you could argue that, like, you've gone through the world as the Warriors of Light and you've fought off these, like, foes for different areas and regional areas and stuff like that. But where does Xande come from? It's just like, oh, there's this evil guy called Xande, lol. Cool. He's Doga and Une's you know?
Yeah.
And it's almost like there's a part later in the game, they're your, I guess you could say, they're your mentors, and you're supposed to kill them to get through and go into the final area, so they can create an item that lets you get into the final area and then take on Xande. But what's a bit weird about it, it's like, we're doing your dirty work for you guys, because this is your foe. So that's why Xande's a bit weak. I think his motivation's fine, but it's like he isn't presented as the Warrior of Light's villain. There's two ways of doing it. You either have your foes like your Gutskos and your Gigamets or whatever that are the villain, and actually the true villain all along was pulling their strings was around that. But that part was the bit that was weak. There was no link between those minor foes and the big foe. Like, there wasn't any case of like, I'm going to get on this villain's good side. None of that happened. It was just very, very like, oh, by the way, this guy's bad.
No, I completely agree with you. I think, again, if we'd heard any more about Xande from earlier in the game, I won't say from the very beginning, because I don't think that's necessarily good storytelling to introduce the villain from the very beginning. But yeah, he's not around enough for it to feel personal. It's just another string of well, this is just what we have to do next.
Totally. I think what I'm saying there, though, is that like there's one of two ways of doing it. You either have that villain that's already existed, or you have, I mean, like Final Fantasy VII, for example. I mean, okay, Sephiroth doesn't appear to a little bit into the story, but he's the main antagonist for a good chunk of the story. In going back to mention again, in Final Fantasy IX, you think Queen Braun's the main villain, and then it turns out that Kuja's been pulling Queen Braun's strings. Done much, much better than you've got these two minor villains that are in different areas you're in. And then, by the way, actually the villain has nothing to do with them directly. It doesn't kind of takes away from his influence on the story that isn't really there.
So going by that, then I reckon you probably don't enjoy the Cloud of Darkness as like the all evil.
No, everything. And again, if it was done better, if it was like, if there was some form of, I guess, the idea of the Cloud of Darkness being, all the evil in the world, if there was some kind of like a spiritual link where all of those different enemies that you fought throughout the story had linked to that in some way. I know that in the last dungeon you meet the Warriors of Dark. If, for example, Gutsko and Gilgamesh, or whatever his name is, and all these people had been linked to that, then it might have tied into it. Their evil doings added to the pot of darkness. That would have been better. I talk about Dragon Ball again. in Dragon Ball GT, notoriously not a very good series of Dragon Ball, there's a part where they use the Dragon Balls to wish, and over time the bad energy builds up in them, which causes them to have shadow dragons come out of them. That's a good narrative design choice. It would have been interesting if like they'd done that. They kind of do that certainly do that in Final Fantasy 16. And they do it a little bit in some of the later titles as well, where each crystal gets destroyed, it damages the world. Final Fantasy 5, we're talking about that. There's a narrative consequence for what that villain's done. Yeah, okay, in that game, it is just one villain just doing everything. Here, it probably would have benefited from them tying into the badness a bit better, I think.
No, I'll agree with you on that. So I think this is actually probably a really good place to bring this up, because I'm not sure if you're aware, the story of Final Fantasy III is kind of very loosely used as a base for some events in Final Fantasy XIV.
Oh, really?
So it was the very first 24-man raid series were introduced with patch 2.1 of Final Fantasy XIV. This was the very first big update for A Realm Reborn, which was the remade version of Final Fantasy XIV. This released very early in 2014. So this was some time ago now. It consists of 3 tiers, I suppose, each with 4 bosses and plenty of trash mobs in between. These consist of the Labyrinth of the Ancients, which is, for those who don't play Final Fantasy XIV, this is the area at the bottom of the Crystal Tower. The next one is Circus Tower, which is being inside the Crystal Tower. And then the final raid is the World of Darkness, wherein the final boss is the Cloud of Darkness. You have plenty of familiar faces in these raids. Xande features, Cloud of Darkness obviously features. Doga and Une are important fixtures, and they introduce a whole new original character who ended up being a lot more important than we thought he ever would be back in those days. Obviously, I'm not going to try and press you to go through and play Final Fantasy XIV just to get through these. Obviously, this is some of the oldest raid content in the game, and as such has been done to death a million times. For those people out there listening, Crystal Tower is my Joker origin story. There is no simpler way to put that. I've been in some fucking situations in those raids. But they are, however, very well implemented into an entirely new world. They don't have anything to do with Final Fantasy III. There is no link beyond these are just characters that have been lifted and name dropped in, but they integrate really, really well to the actual world themselves as kind of an original story, which I think is really commendable. It does help that the models look really nice as well. Xande is given an all-new facelift, and you get to beat the shit out of him again. What's more to love? The Cloud of Darkness is absolutely gigantic, and I'd say more menacing than the original Final Fantasy III iteration of the Cloud of Darkness, if not as difficult, then just in sheer scale, because she towers over everyone else that's in the raid. And the Labyrinth of the Ancients exists. It's there. That's about the kindest thing that I can say to it at this point.
It's interesting that this ties in with the point we were making earlier about this being a template for a lot of things later. And it's really good to see this get its due in some respects for that. I think that's what they've done there with that. I mean, that's 10 years ago, isn't it now, for 2014? But
I think one of those things of it's old content and it's very tired content now, but it still really does stand up in the actual lore. And a lot of the stuff within 14 stuff is dependent on Crystal Tower. It is very important. And I think template is probably the best way that you could describe 3. And the fact that it has been lifted and given this amount of love and care, and even now in 2024, it's still important to the story, really does actually speak quite well of the original media. You wouldn't be able to do that necessarily with something else. And sure, it isn't in its original location anymore, but that doesn't mean that it's bad.
No, I think that it's probably the relationship Japan's got with this game has had an influence with it, because from what I understand, this was seen as their classic game that they harken back to, because they played it when they were younger, whereas we didn't get this too much later. It was this more legendary thing,
Yeah.
So what I mean by that is that we have a different experience with the actual game. They have more of an experience with the points within the game, and I think that ties in with the points I was making before about the callbacks in Final Fantasy IX, which for example, I thought initially that the callback to Final Fantasy III in Final Fantasy IX was very limited. So I don't know if you know about the specific little Easter egg in Final Fantasy IX that alludes to this game. Do you know of the specific Easter egg? So the Easter egg I remember from being a kid. Now, if you remember, famously, the Final Fantasy IX guidebook was trash. and referred to the website they were pushing at the time, which was Play Online. Early days of the internet. I think both versions of the guidebook, the American and the European version, I don't know about the Japanese version, whether there is one, were pushing their website. And it was like, oh, if you want to find out more, go online. Very, very difficult to actually find that. It was a bit annoying back in the time, especially considering the fact that no one really had the internet when that book came out. I certainly didn't. Anyway, one of the things that the guide does tell you, or hint to you very specifically, is that if you go to the auction house in Final Fantasy IX,
of course,
you can buy Doga's artifact and Une's mirror. Une is spelt differently in Final Fantasy IX. It's Une. I always pronounced it as Une's mirror, like Une French, like one. You get those artifacts and take them to the Black Mage Village and play them on an old gramophone. You get a remix of Doga and Une's theme in the game, which stays playing in that area until you leave. Again, I remember getting that theme in the game. Beautiful bit of music, I think. Very sort of, I don't know how you describe it. It's just a very beautiful little
evocative. I think it's very dreamlike.
It's very like that old. You found an old ancient place that you need to explore. It's got a very like library feel to it. You know what I mean? Like lovely little bit of music. Now, interestingly, having played 3 all the way through, there's so much more in 9 that pulls back to it. I think we mentioned before about Kuja and his theme, and also when you go into the final world, you can fight different versions of Xande. It's like fake Xande, which is very similar to Memoria in Final Fantasy IX, where you can fight crystal versions of the 4 fiends you've fought before in the past. There's also the part where at the end of the game of 3, you fight the Cloud of Darkness the first time after you've beaten Xande, and the Cloud of Darkness kills you, and it's a scripted encounter where you can't beat it, which you know how I feel about them. And and then Une and Doga come in and revive you, and that the same thing happens in Final Fantasy IX, where you die against Kuja and then you come back, you get revived. But there's also a couple more little things about in Final Fantasy IX. There's a callback. If you go into Gulag Volcano, there's Une the mole has written a note on the wall, and then the dwarves appear in this game and say "Lally Ho."
Yes,
I think that's the first time the dwarves appear and say "Lally Ho." They come back in 4 and 5, and then 9 as well. The other bit from Final Fantasy IX, the king trying to kill his son, which Queen Bran does under influence, tries to kill her daughter, which I think is probably not something done by accident. It's probably a callback to that story beat, I would say. To be fair, I think it's probably one of the only parts of the game that shocked me when I played it recently. Because, like I say, a lot of the story is quite loose and weak. And then all of a sudden, Prince Alice is attempted murder by his father, the king. And then it turns out that this king's under a spell or under some form of influence from another being, which is similar to Final Fantasy IX. There's a lot of little pullbacks in that game. And of course, Final Fantasy IX was released as a title as a look back over the shoulder. I just find it interesting how clearly this game in the Final Fantasy sphere, it's always been there. Whereas to me, it feels a bit more new because I'm quite new to it. If that makes sense,
No, absolutely it does.
And you can see that in the Final Fantasy 14 influence as well. It's not something that's like, oh, that really obscure game, let's bring something from that. It's like, oh yeah, let's bring that in from Final Fantasy 3. It's a natural thing for them to do, which is really cool, I think.
It absolutely is. It also just makes me think that it's such a shame that we didn't get it until so late in not the development cycle, but in its lifetime, really. Like, I can think of quite a few people that would have really enjoyed playing this growing up. It's exactly their kind of game. But unfortunately, we had to wait. Yeah,
and we had to wait until 2021 for an actually proper 2D remake of the game, which is a bit of a shame. And actually, that's probably the best way to play the game, if I'm totally honest with you.
Better late than never.
Yeah, better late than never, and it's nice to be able to play. And what I liked about my experience playing it is that actually I'd left it a long time, and I enjoyed it. It wasn't like, I would have enjoyed this if I played it years ago. I thought, this is quite a good experience for me. That's it from me on Final Fantasy 3. Overall, I'd say it was a fun experience.
What would you give it final rating out of 10?
In terms of its overall impact, like as a greatness, I'd say it's an 8 out of 10. But in terms of it generally, like thinking about it critically, 6 probably.
I'd still say that's a respectable score for it.
Yeah. What about you?
I'm with you on the 8 for
greatness.
Just general greatness and legacy. Personally, I would probably give it a 5. And I'm being very, very nice and not dragging it down to like the negative numbers because of that fucking encounter with the Cloud of Darkness.
We definitely look at the venom. We definitely need to at some point have a sort of cultural exchange where I play the DS version. Sorry, I get tortured with the DS version and you play the Pixel remaster and have a nice time.
I'll get to the final boss again and I'll still whiff it and I'll just be angry for the rest of my life.
I know the feeling. I've done that with stuff before and thrown it into abyss because I hate it so much. Yes, I remember my friend, slightly tangentially, my friend. There's a game on the SNES called the Page Master, which is notoriously awful. And my friend actually played it at his house and got so frustrated with it that he pulled it out of his SNES and threw it in my bag, saying, "That's yours now." And eventually, I gave it back to him. But okay, so that's it for Final Fantasy 3. I really enjoyed talking about Final Fantasy 3. Like you said there, I think it's probably more fun talking about this game's legacy than it is actually playing it. So that's it for the game. Moving on to the wild card. If I were to turn around to you and say, Christopher Judge, what would come to your mind?
Oh, the name rings a bell, but I couldn't tell you anything about him.
Christopher Judge plays Kratos in God of War.
Okay.
Right, so that's the link for gaming, and that's what a lot of gamers know him as. But Christopher Judge also notably played Teal'c in Stargate franchise, which I've mentioned before is a massive thing that I like. So basically, Christopher Judge is now synonymous with gaming and voice acting, but it's not the first time he's been involved in gaming.
Right.
I think he'd been involved before. He'd done voice acting gigs in the past, so it's not like this is like a forgotten thing. But essentially, there was a game that was going to be released called Stargate SG-1: The Alliance, which never happened.
Okay.
To my eternal annoyance, let's put it that way. If I, when you got this thing where you want to go back in time and make one thing happen, this would probably be the thing I'd make happen. So this was basically a game that was intended for release on the PS2, Xbox, and PC, and set during the 7th and 8th season of the Stargate SG-1 TV show, which aired from 2004 to 2005, most notably airing in the UK before anywhere else, because we love Stargate so much in the UK. So this game featured the 4 main cast members at the time, or certainly the 4 main characters in season 7, and was in development as like a first-person shooter, which at the time was the thing. You had, looking at the landscape of games, you had Halo 2 and Half-Life 2 were the biggest titles in the world. Without a doubt, because before the Wii, so it was before the whole, family-friendly stuff came in. Obviously, there was family-friendly games, but it was before the party gaming thing took over. Pretty much at that time, it was FPS or nothing, really. I mean, it was kind of felt like the period before other genres came in and took a leap forward. The developer that was developing this game were called Perception, and they approached MGM, who owned the rights to Stargate, to make the game, because they reckoned that Stargate at the time, as it was a popular franchise, would be a perfect fit for the games market. It's interesting because Perception had the entire access to the entire show at the time, which was a bigger deal at the time because this was before the whole thing was on Blu-ray and streaming services, because they didn't exist. And they had all the blueprints from behind the scenes stuff, and they had creative freedom to do what they wanted with the story and everything pretty much. And it would be signed off.
Very generous.
It would be signed off at the end if there was anything that went out of genre or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So basically you had a bunch of fans making a game.
That sounds ideal.
Yeah. Now, they came up with a main villain, which would actually add to the lore of the series without retconning anything as well. And apparently at one point they were going to, before this game was inevitably cancelled, they were going to mention the villain in an episode and link together. And I think I mentioned in the past that Stargate's very, very good at creating continuity without necessarily making it important for you to watch everything. So the first trailer of the game was actually in an episode of the show, which was the episode called Avatar, of all things, broadcast in August 2004. And the premise of the episode is that Teal'c, played by Christopher Judge, who's Kratos, goes into a simulation chair to fight off the bad guys around the base. And a lot of the B-roll of the episode is shots of the actual game, in-engine shots of the game. Now, at the time, this was the coolest thing ever.
I can imagine, yeah.
And I still watch this one with my dad. We remember Dad watched Stargate quite a lot, and this is one we really like. We're both gamers as well, so we both like the shooting element of it. But if you watch it now, it's obvious what it's supposed to be. It's a flipping trailer, And I know people that have got into the Stargate series more recently that think this is a bit of a filler episode, and I can understand where they're coming from, because, of course, the game design leaves a lot to be desired now. But at the time, oh my God, it was top of the range, graphics, everything like that. And of course, notably in this episode, as I mentioned Christopher Judge to start off this, one of the characters turns around to him and says, "Oh yeah, you've played Doom," and talks about how he's going to go and shoot a bunch of enemies. And he goes, "I've played Def Jam Vendetta." Now, he mentions Def Jam Vendetta because Christopher Judge
sounds like a tongue twister.
Christopher Judge played a character in the game Def Jam Vendetta. So yeah, he's always been a bit of a gamer, Chris Judge. And if we ever do something at a convention and I bump into Chris Judge, I will proper fangirl and everything like that.
I'll make sure to get pictures of that.
So Perception, we're also going to develop another game which was going to be based off of the Stargate Atlantis spin-off series, which I also actually think is the better series of the 3 series that have been released because the fourth one doesn't exist for Stargate. They were making an RPG for Atlantis, which sounds like the best thing ever, 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 and I'm gutted it never ever happened, which is upsetting. The actual teaser trailer that was after this episode was shown at E3 in 2005 with a playable level and members of the cast present, and there was also a full-size Stargate at
That sounds
E3.
cool.
Yeah. Now, if I were to flip a coin between going to E3 2005 and E3 1999, I don't know which I choose, because E3 1999 had the tower with the flipping Final Fantasy VIII stuff in it. Like, but E3 2005 had a fucking Stargate. I mean, like, I don't know. Like honestly, it's like, which do I pick? Shame it was cancelled, but there's obviously people that actually have bits of this game with fully voiced parts. And this was in like the alpha stage, so it was pretty much done.
Wow.
When I say pretty much done, I mean, I don't want to take away from game designers and say, oh, why not just release it, because it was buggy as hell. But like the entire cast had recorded all their dialogue. It was there. The sort of, the cake was prepared. It just wasn't baked yet, for want of a better description.
Pretty late in the cycle to have a cancellation
I
slapped
know.
on it as well. Do you have any idea why?
I think it was to do with funding and stuff like that. I mean, I did try and read into it, but it's difficult to find information on that. There's speculation and stuff like that about how the plug was pulled on it because of licensing and things like that. I don't know the actual story of that. I'd have to dig into that, and it's probably one of those like we'll never know for sure type things. Considering the fact that they highlighted the game in an episode of the TV show, it was ready to go, and this was bigged up to death. It was going to be a big thing. It used a souped up version of the Unreal 2.5 engine, which probably means something to other people. They had digital scans of the main cast. It's a big deal at the time. It was one of those things where we talked before in the past about properties and titles and stuff like that. Notably Dragon Ball Z, that the game will come out and it might not be that good a game, but it'll be a good game for the fans of the series. Yeah. By the looks of it, this would have been, I wouldn't say like, a massively impactful title, but like from some of the stuff they said they were going to be in it, it looked like it would have been a hit for the people that were fans of the series, but probably also a very popular game as well in its own right, by the looks of things, because it was unique enough to be able to be quite an interesting concept for the general gaming audience. You know what I mean? Yeah, it's a bit of a shame.
Oh, that's really quite interesting.
Yeah, and you can go on YouTube and find footage of people that have played this game that aren't allowed to release it, weirdly, considering the fact that it's pretty much already done. I mean, I'm sure you could probably find a copy of it somewhere. I wouldn't know anything about that though. So, but it's just a shame. And I think if this podcast ever takes off and becomes really influential, then maybe I'll get hold of those developers and find out a way for them to release the game.
That's the ultimate dream now, is it?
Yeah, well, it's Adam Korolik, didn't he? He's a YouTuber, and he ended up being a massive fan of Shenmue, and I think he was instrumental in the release of Shenmue 3, from what I understand. So it can happen. I want to bring back citrus sharp polos and bring Stargate SG-1 the Alliance out. That's my goal in life. So that's it for my wild card. Yeah, so I just thought I'd use an excuse to talk about Stargate, to be honest with you. So, but no, I really want that game to come out at some point. Even if it's not very good and it's dated, I will still enjoy it.
Genuinely really quite interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Right, my wild card today, I got a little bit bogged down in the weeds. I was thinking about trying to relate our FF3 discussion to something, and the only thing that I could think of was old arcade games. Now, Final Fantasy was never an arcade game, but I kind of just ended up down the rabbit hole of all the old stuff I used to play and how bad they were probably. And I mentioned to you earlier today, I actually discovered that Steam has the Golden Axe games on it, and that I had purchased them, and I'm very much looking forward to playing them. But they aren't the games that I was actually going to be thinking about as far as stuff that I used to play when I was younger. Now, this was part of the same bundle. When I was a lot younger, I want to say probably around 7 or 8, my parents had a friend who had, I guess, just a dump of old arcade games on his old PC. And now we're talking like an old PC. A lot of them were not very fun for me as a small child to be playing. I don't really want to be getting fighter jets and, Space Invaders and shit like that. But there was a game that I returned to again and again because there was another child. My parents' friends also had a kid who was a couple of years younger than me, and we used to try and find all of the 2-player games to play together so that we weren't fighting over the keyboard. One of these games was a side-scroller called Nemo. Now, I am pretty certain that you have never heard of this. Most people have never heard of this. This has nothing whatsoever to do with the fish. Nemo is a side-scroller from Capcom, of all people, that was released in 1990. Now, it wasn't the first Nemo game of its franchise. There was an earlier game on the NES, again by Capcom, which I have never played. Apparently wasn't fantastic, but it still exists. It's actually based on an animated musical film from 1989, which was based on the comic strip of the same name, which was Little Nemo Adventures in Slumberland, by a comic artist called Winsor McCay. Now, as far as I understand it, the actual anime movie was a collaboration between Japanese and US studios. There were people poached from high-ranking studios as Disney, Lucasfilm, Warner Brothers, Studio Ghibli. So, it wasn't a small endeavor. It absolutely fucking bombed box office, and it's one of those things that, like, if you have a VHS of it, hold on to that shit, make sure it's in good condition, because I don't think a lot of people held onto theirs. The original comic strip, which was how all of this started, it was a full-page weekly strip, completely in color, which just depicted a young boy having fanciful dreams, and every single one always ends the same way. He wakes up. It originally ran in the New York Herald from 1905 until 1911. It then went to the New York American until 1914, I believe. It then went back to the Herald and then back to NYA until its cancellation in 1927. And it's one of those things that I didn't realize there was quite so much history about it. There were attempts to put it on stage as theater. I think there were students in the last 10 or 15 years that attempted to put it onto opera. There was a short play that was put on in 2017. McKay himself was actually really important in early animation history. He involved himself in a silent film that was developed in 1911. This short film is available on Wikipedia. It is informally known as Little Nemo. It is, for the most part, live action, but it has an animated segment in it. McKay himself actually drew around 4,000 drawings to make this animation happen. Now, considering the very first hand-drawn animation was only 3 years prior, and that animation is called Phantasmagory by Emile Cole, is only about a minute long and has 700 drawings. So you can imagine this man was very, very talented at what he did. The Nemo arcade game is very interesting. It's very colorful, and it follows the adventures of Nemo in Slumberland again. I believe the plot of the game is he is traveling to meet the king of Slumberland, a man called King Morpheus. However, something goes wrong in Slumberland and there are monsters everywhere, so Nemo has to travel through it with a companion, a man named Flip, who is the two-player, who I always was, because I had to be fucking two-player, didn't I? The Nightmare King is unleashed at some point and kidnaps the king's daughter, and you have to battle through Land of Nightmares. It's overall a very, very strange adventure, but its graphics aren't really like anything I've ever seen. It's very, very colorful. It's very jarringly childish, but still very memorable, I find. Now, I looked up on arcademuseum.com to see just how many of versions of this game actually still exist. Not very many. Only 229 arcade machines were ever released for this game, and its database now only has 9 known instances of the game being recorded. Only 1 is the original machine. All 8 rest of them are circuit boards only. No one that I've ever spoken to has ever heard about this game, which is very surprising because you'll never guess who the composer is.
Who's the composer then?
Yoko Shimomura.
Is it really?
She isn't credited properly in the actual game itself, which unfortunately was very, very common for Capcom at the time, wanting it to be like a Capcom property as opposed to these people have worked on it. Shimomura is listed in the credits as Shimopi, as in Shimomura producer, and plenty of the other credits are actually labeled very, very similarly. But Yoko Shimomura's actual Wikipedia page does list Nemo as a credit, original sound composer, which I
incredible.
was absolutely blown away by because it doesn't sound like anything else she's ever put out as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, I've just looked on the wiki, and the composer is listed as, for the NES game, is listed as Junko Tamiya. Presumably it's different soundtrack than the one in the arcades. Now that's, I didn't know anything about that, and that's incredible considering the fact that I'm a bit of an animation geek and also a bit of a gaming geek. So I think I'd heard the term Little Nemo before, and I'm just looking at cover art. I've seen the cover art before. Kid on the Bed. I've seen that before. And yeah.
There is a long play on YouTube, which I believe is only about half an hour long if you want to experience that trip for yourself. But yeah, I spent hours of my childhood playing this 2-player with just with another kid, just so that we weren't bored and didn't want to fight over like Bubble Bobble or anything like that. So this one's pretty special to me, even though I'm the only person in the world that's fucking heard of it.
You've got to rep those games and do it. People do that with random games before, and then they become iconic. Got to be done. That's fascinating. I mean, I definitely at some point. You mentioned there about the composer. I'd love to talk about some of the composers throughout gaming history because I know that I can't remember the YouTube video. I have to find it. There was someone describing about how a lot of the female composers were sort of forgotten about because of the fact that they had to give themselves male names in history.
This
Japanese.
wasn't H Bomber Guy by any chance, was it?
I know H Bomber Guy's talked about stuff like that before, and this wasn't. I don't think this was H Bomber Guy video. No,
I only bring that up because I recently watched his plagiarism and you video for the first time because I'm 9 months late to everything. But he does make a very important point that crediting people is very, very important, and actually listed Shimomura herself as one of those people that isn't credited correctly. So that's kind of like, wow, everything's connected. This keeps happening in my life.
It depends on it probably took about 9 months to watch that video, didn't it? I mean, like obviously, like talking about H Bomber Guy, like the influence he has when he releases a video is incredible because everyone goes mad over it. I mean, I could sing his praises to the cows come home because he's made some incredible impact on positively, I think, for a lot of things. I mean,
positive impact. He's a very well researched YouTuber, very, very funny as well, I find.
I love that. I mean, I'm a stickler for making sure everything's credited. I mean, I wouldn't say I'm anywhere near as good as that, but I remember when I did my video on the Final Fantasy VIII demos and stuff like that, and I went through and I tried to find evidence that the ballroom scene was shown on the PS2 hardware at E3. There is no single source I can find, a primary source that shows it was there, but there's lots of people that said that they saw it there, and I'm like, no, I can't say it was there just because someone else said it was. I have to have seen it myself or have someone back it up and say and everything like that. So I mean, I guess that's him influencing me. I guess it makes it very difficult for him to be sued in any way because he's backed it all up.
Yeah.
So no.
The only other point that I will make about Nemo is that I did look to see if there was any of McKay's original work that still exists out there. Apparently, unfortunately, it has been very poorly preserved. He kept a lot of his originals, and a lot did survive, but unfortunately, there was a larger chunk that was destroyed in a fire in the late 1930s. However, on a positive note, most of his surviving artwork does remain within his own family, so it's nice that they still have that collection of history, because I cannot imagine someone who was probably more influential as an early pioneer of animated history. There's no overstating his work. I will say it is very attractive as an art style. It's all very heavily based on Art Nouveau, which I personally very much enjoy as an art movement anyway. So if you are into that kind of thing, then there's a whole world of comics out there waiting for you.
There's loads of random anime that I'd like to dig into. That's an interesting thing because I'm amazed I've seen the box art for the game, but I'm amazed I've never heard of the animation you talked about in 1989. There's one I've got bookmarked that keeps popping up as a thing, which is The Curse of Kazuo, which is like a 43-minute video, which looks like a horror thing. There's loads of random anime things that I'd love to delve into. That was fascinating. I really, really enjoyed listening to you talk about that. So thank you for that. So where can we find you online, Mol?
I can be found as ever on Twitter as @Adramalek. Where can we find you, Jack?
You can find me on Twitter as JackMullen8, and also you can find us on Twitter now at EXP Required. Please follow us on there, and also our YouTube channel EXP Required, which we would love for you to check out. And I think, like you said, Mol, even if you don't agree with our opinions, you might laugh at some of our attempts at jokes. So, so thank you very much for joining me. Speak to you next time. See you later, everyone.
Thank you, Jack. Bye-bye.